Hi everybody, and in this video we are going to be talking about the basic care for Borneo File-Eared frogs. So please, as always, sit back, relax and enjoy the content. So its namesake kind of gives it away where these guys are endemic to. So these guys are endemic to the island of Borneo, which is the largest island in Southeast Asia. Borneo is divided among 3 different countries, so Brunei, Indonesia and Malaysia. So these guys are typically found in the lowlands, but can also be found up to 1,000 meters above sea level. So their favorite kind of biomes that they inhabit are like secondary growth forests on the edge of primary forests, always near a water source. Now, what is a secondary and primary growth forest, you ask? Well, I am here to tell you. Secondary growth forests are forests that have typically been previously logged, but have also now started to regenerate. So these forests tend to be a lot more compacted, so trees are a lot more densely packed together, whereas primary forests, their trees are kind of spread apart a little bit more. So with your secondary growth forests as well, they would typically have a lot less ground vegetation on there, which is going to be quite important, especially if you want to kind of do a bioactive setup for your frogs. So how big do these frogs get? So there is difference between the sexes, so there is a little bit of sexual dimorphism in size. So males will typically get around about 60 to 80 millimeters, whereas females will definitely get 280, if not 100 millimeters. So there is quite a size difference. Now, what type of enclosure are we going to house our Borneo File-Eareds in? So if you had a pair of frogs, we would typically recommend as a minimum 45 centimeters by 45 centimeters by 60 centimeters. However, if you want to go bigger, definitely do so. Also, if you do plan on adding potentially more frogs, or you want to start off with more frogs, we would definitely recommend getting a larger enclosure. As with most arboreal tree frogs, we do recommend these guys to be kept in groups or in pairs. Now, like with most frogs, these guys are going to want it quite humid, so we would recommend anywhere from around about 60 to 80, creeping up to the 90% humidity. This is going to be easily achieved by having a really thick substrate and a nice sized water dish in there, but we'll talk about that when we move on to our decor. Now, in terms of heating, these guys can be found sometimes out in the open, so they're not as thigmo-conforming as what we once previously thought. Now, you're not going to want to offer them a really harsh basking spot bulb. Anything around about 30 degrees for a basking spot is going to be absolutely fine. The ambient temperature inside the enclosure ideally should sit around about 27 in the warm bit of the enclosure and around about 24 in the cooler end. On a night time, you're not really going to want it to drop below 22 degrees. If it does drop below 22 to 21 to 20, you'll be okay. If you're noticing that it's dropping to the teens, then we definitely would recommend an additional heat source for nighttime. So this can be achieved by applying a ceramic heat emitter. If as well you do decide to have a large body of water in there, you can also get kind of a fish tank heater to heat the water. This is going to help maintain the temperature inside the enclosure. Not by a great deal, but just a little bit. Now, what are we going to do in terms of controlling the temperature inside this enclosure? Now, with your basking spot bulbs, we would always recommend using a dimming thermostat. And if you're using a ceramic heat bulb for a nighttime, we would always recommend using a pulse proportional. Now, you can use a mat stat, but the pulse proportionals are a lot better to use, as they are designed for ceramic heat bulbs. Other forms of lighting that you can pop in there, always recommend using UVB. Now, these guys, you can pop a Ferguson Zone 1 bulb in there, or a Ferguson Zone 2 bulb in there. So this is going to be dependent on how tall your enclosure is. If we're just basing it off the 45, 60. So if it's 60 centimeters tall, definitely use a Ferguson Zone 1 bulb. Anything taller than that, we would definitely recommend using a Ferguson Zone 2. Also, make sure that the canopy, above, is quite well covered, so the animal is going to have access to different levels of UV. Another form of light that we definitely would recommend popping in there would be LED. Now, LED is really good for your plant growth, which is going to be vital for, one, maintaining humidity inside the enclosure, and as well for your general frog's health. And as well as a side note, it does look pretty cool in there having live plants, but I might be biased. But having LED in there is also pretty good for the animal's vision, and as well giving the animal a nice photo period. So letting that animal know when it needs to be awake, when it needs to be asleep, when it's daytime, nighttime. You get the idea. In terms of activity level, these guys are primarily more a nocturnal species, but as said previously, they can be found out during the day. So they're not going to be super active during the day, but you might just find them out like basking like on a leaf. So they will take in that heat and they will also take in that UVB. The substrates that we would typically use and also recommend inside the store are things like the ZoomMed Reptisoil, the ProRep BioLife, the Arcadia Earth Mix, and the Lucky Reptile Jungle Bedding. You can also use cocoa fibers if you want to. I prefer using these ones because these are quite nutrient rich. So these are really going to be super beneficial for our live plants. But again, if you just want to use cocoa fiber and you don't want to use live plants, that's okay, but we definitely would recommend using them. Moving on to Decor now. So again, my favorite bit of these videos and in general when we're kitting them out in the store. So what decor pieces can you pop inside your enclosure? So as always, we would strongly recommend using live plants. We now typically don't recommend using plastic or like faux plants, just because some of them can be quite damaging to the frog. So another thing that you're going to want to definitely pop in there is a decent enough water area in your enclosure for your frog. Now, you can do this as like a custom made jobby if you want to, or you can just pop and get like a decently sized bowl from like a reptile store. Make sure that the frog can like definitely submerge itself and have a little bit of a swim if it wants to. Again, it's all about choice and offering these animals the choice. We must always remember as well that with the large water areas, we need to give these animals access points so they can get in and get out safely, so they don't just sit in there and potentially drown. So what we would always recommend is doing kind of like a staircase kind of thing. You can do this out of like rocks. Another method that you can also use is partially submerging some like branches in there. So you can have it so the branch is on the outside going into the pool, or you can have the branch on the inside of the pool coming out of it. Again, we would always recommend offering multiple access points out of the pool for your frog. So with these guys inhabiting quite densely packed kind of like forested areas, we would definitely recommend that you try and replicate this. So you can do this by going to like reptile stores that should sell things like liana woods, talawa woods, red moors, dark moors, all the different kinds of woods that you could possibly think and wish for. So moving on to the animal's diet. So what are these guys going to eat? So these guys are primarily insectivores. So in captivity, we basically just feed them insects and a wide variety of insects as well. So we would always recommend using things like crickets, locusts, waxworms, mealworms, all sorts of bits and bobs. Don't just stick with one thing. Some frogs can be quite picky. I am well aware and definitely understand that. Our colleague Emma, who got this lovely footage for you all that you're watching, her frogs are quite picky. But when they're babies, we would definitely try and recommend giving them a wide variety as humanly possible. And as well, with all live food, you must always ensure that these are supplemented. So you can use broad spectrum supplements, or if you wanted to, you could use like individual supplements, like more tailored to the animal's needs. It's completely up to you. Let's talk about the Borneo File-Eared Frog's life cycle. So Emma was lucky enough to catch the footage of her frogs making these foam nests, and also the tadpoles. So it all starts off when the male starts to vocalize. So once the male starts to vocalize, bear in mind this can be quite loud, the female will reciprocate this noise with some like little toe tappy type dances. Once the male has located the female, copulation then begins. The male will hold onto the back of the female. This is called amplexis, and this can last for several days. until the female is ready to breed. The female will then start making her foam nest. She does this by secreting excess mucus through her skin and moving her legs in kind of like a circular kind of motion. So this is going to agitate the mucus and really aerate it, kind of like making a cake. Once a decent enough base layer of foam is produced, the female will then start depositing these eggs in this foamy cocoon. The male will fertilize these eggs as they are going into the cocoon. The nest is always located over kind of like a large body of water. This is so like when the tadpoles are ready to emerge, they can just plop straight into the water. Typically 1 to 2 weeks after the nest has been constructed and the eggs have been fertilized, the tadpoles will drop into the water below. In the wild, the rain will help wash these tadpoles into the water. In captivity, this can be achieved by using a misting system. From the tadpole stage, it roughly takes around about 3 to 4 weeks until they start to develop their hind legs. During this aquatic stage, tadpoles will feed upon items like algae, invertebrates, amongst other things. Within the captive environment, most people will typically raise these tadpoles on like fish food, so like the pelleted diets or the flakes. Further on from that, usually around a week, they will obtain their stripy kind of pattern. They will keep this pattern all the way through to adulthood. At this stage, their body shape will also start to change. It will start to resemble more of their like adult counterparts. So look at those like angles on them instead of being kind of like round blobs with tails. Once they develop their front legs, the frogs will then start to emerge out of the water. However, they will not feed until they have completely absorbed their tail. Once the tail is fully absorbed, this is typically when we'll see them start to predate upon live vertebrates. And that about wraps us up. So thank you very much, guys, for sticking all the way through to the end. Emma provided the footage, so we just thought it'd be really cool to show you the life cycle of these frogs. But anyway, without further ado, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Ta-ra.